I will introduce our first session moderator here. This is for the understanding the human visual system. Pete Leday is our moderator. He is a prominent engineering executive in cinema, broadcast, and digital media with extensive experience in deployment of systems worldwide. He currently serves as CTO of Mission Rock Digital in San Francisco. Previously, he was the senior vice president of Sony's Silicon Valley R&D labs, where his work included workflow software for digital cinema production, stereoscopic imaging, and 4K laser projectors for digital cinema. He is past president of SMPTE and an SMPTE fellow. He is also the founding chairman of the Laser Illuminated Projector Association, so I think you'll see him again later today. He's a frequent speaker on the future of broadcast, ultra HD television, stereoscopic 3D, laser displays, and now the human visual system. Morning, Pete.
Thank you. Ellie, you're going to come up after for the next speaker? Yeah. Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for coming out here in this early morning on a weekend to share time with us. We hope to make it worth your while. This first session is on human visual system, a topic I wish I knew more about, and I think 90 minutes from now I will. When you think about it, the conversion to digital media started many decades ago. 20 years ago this month, we were launching digital satellite services to the home using the precursor of MPEG-2, which was then in prototype form. 10 years ago, there were many demonstrations, including here at NAB, of digital cinema projection. And we argued over 2K or 4K and all the other attributes 10 years ago. But if you think about it, the visual models that we used at the time were based on many previous decades of experience. For example, we chose 24 frame. Was that based on human visual acuity? I don't think so. It was really based on the Vitaphone and the synchronization to sound systems when a 24 frame per second average was established. Television chose 25 or 30 frames per second, not because that's what was most pleasing to the visual eye, but because of the need to synchronize to power line frequencies in the respective countries. 60 fields per second here in the US and 50 fields per second in Europe and other parts of the world. Color was selected not by what the eye could see, but what color phosphors were able to reproduce on a CRT screen and on what emulsions were able to be produced in the wonderful labs of Kodak and others. Dynamic range, well, that had to do with the noise floor on electronic transmission or the optical noise of the projection systems on the low end in terms of what the density of the emulsions could be on film. And on the high end, the bright end of the scale, it had to do with how much light could be emitted by a CRT, and in a movie theater, how bright you could get that xenon arc lamp, or before that, the carbon arc to illuminate the screen. Now that we're in the digital world, we've become to, just in the past couple of years, come to realize that there's many, many other options available to us. But in order to choose the right ones that are going to be most pleasing to our audiences, whether in television, mobile, or in the cinema, we need to understand more about just what the eye is seeing. And the more you learn about the human visual system, the more complex you'll understand it to be. That's the theme for today, and in order to tell that story, we have four of the most distinguished experts in various aspects of the human visual system that we've convened today. Matter of fact, 3 of our speakers will be presenting new findings that are very recently out of the laboratory, so you'll be among the first to hear the results of these studies. We're going to organize this by having the 4 speakers make their presentations, and we'll leave time at the end for a panel Q&A, so please have your questions ready. And I want to especially acknowledge Scott Daly from Dolby, who was able to pull together some of these speakers from around the world and really organized the theme and the research that was done here. And Scott's also going to join us for the Q&A at the end of the session. So save your questions for the end and look forward to learning a lot. There'll be a test afterwards. Our first distinguished speaker today is Dr. Jenny Reed. Dr. Reed did her doctorate in theoretical astrophysics at Oxford University before moving to visual neuroscience. After spending 4 years in the USA working at the National Institutes of Health, in 2005 she returned to the UK with a research fellowship from the Royal Society. Britain's National Academy of Science. She is now a reader, which is an associate professor for us US people, in visual science at the Newcastle University's Institute for Neuroscience in the beautiful northeast of England. Dr. Reed runs a multidisciplinary research lab examining many aspects of vision, especially 3D or stereoscopic vision. Her research interests include how vision may be altered in clinical conditions like strabismus, you have to help me with that, Jenny, or epilepsy, and how viewers perceive depth in 3D displays and how 3D vision works in insects. We'll be learning about all of that and more. Please welcome Dr. Jenny Reed.
Hello, it's great to be with you today. So could I have my slides? Super. The brief I was given for this session was to consider which knobs we might turn to improve the quality of a visual image. And I want to talk in my brief presentation today about 4 possible knobs. And for each one, I'm going to consider I'm going to try and do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, taking into account what we know about the human visual system, to consider how far we need to turn that knob in order to reproduce reality as far as the human visual system is concerned. Now, of course, whether reproducing reality is the right thing to be doing from an artistic or an aesthetic point of view is a different question entirely, and one I won't touch on. For each of those knobs, I'm going to try and end with a sort of post-it note summary of where we are now and where we should be if we want to reproduce reality. So I'm going to start with spatial resolution. So when we talk about the resolution of a display, we mean how much detail it can represent. When we talk about the resolution of the human visual system, we basically mean how much detail we can see. It's also known as visual acuity. Now, if you go to your optometrist, they'll probably measure this with a letter chart like this one. But in vision science, we tend to use the contrast sensitivity function. And this image on the screen basically enables you to read off your own contrast sensitivity function. So for those of you who've not seen this one before, just to point out that from left to right, the spatial frequency of the stripes are increasing. So low frequency, broad stripes, high frequency, narrow stripes, or fine detail. And the contrast is decreasing from bottom to top. So at the bottom we have high contrast, the stripes are going between black and white, and at the top, low contrast, they're going from light grey to dark grey. Now if you look at that image and you consider how far up the screen you can see the stripes, I imagine for most of you, you would draw a line something like this. But what I want to point out is that that line is entirely in your own head. As far as the projector is concerned, it's displaying the same shades of grey in each horizontal line of the image. It's just that your visual system is more sensitive to them at some frequencies than others. Where we're less sensitive, then by definition, we need more contrast in order to see that detail. And as you go up to high frequencies, you find that eventually we can't see the stripes at all. They just appear uniform grey, and that's the limit of our resolution. So if you measure that properly in the lab, then under brightly lit photopic conditions, you'll get a curve something like this. And you find that we humans can see detail right up to 60 cycles per degree visual angle. So that means that the stripes then are 1 minute of arc, 1/60th of 1 degree apart. So armed with that information, we can ask, what pixel density do we need then in order to display all visible detail? And the problem, of course, is that depends on viewing distance. You can see we want 2 pixels to subtend 1 minute of arc, so that depends how far away you're sitting. Okay, so we can ask, what pixel density do you need in order to display all visible detail at the recommended viewing distance? So SMPTE very helpfully has given us a recommended viewing distance. SMPTE reckons you should be sitting far enough back that your screen subtends 30 degrees at your eye. So armed with that, you can plug it into the equations and you work out that you need something like 3,700 pixels in order to display all detail that would in any case be visible to a human. So that's actually pretty good, really. HD TV with 1920 pixels across isn't quite there, but 4K is very much the sort of resolution we need. Of course, not everyone's always going to be sitting at the recommended distance. Of course, in a cinema, people at the front row are going to be much closer than those at the back, obviously. So we can also turn it around and say, given a particular display, how close can I sit in order that I'm not limited by the pixel density? And for HDTV, it turns out that's quite far back. You have to be 3.6 picture widths away. If you want to sit as close as 1 picture width to the screen, then you need nearly 7,000 pixels across. But basically, my kind of take-home message on spatial resolution would be that we're essentially there. With 4K, we are basically at the highest resolutions which you would need for entertainment purposes. What about temporal resolution then, moving on to time? So there we can talk about our ability to see flicker at different frequencies, and we can measure a temporal contrast sensitivity function in exactly the same way as we just did for spatial. It turns out that we're most sensitive to flicker at around 20 Hertz, 20 cycles per second, and we can see flicker up to, once again, 60 Hertz. So you can see that it's quite unfortunate the early cinema, for technical reasons, were limited to frame rates of about 16 to 24 Hertz, and they really were one flash at a time. You can see why early cinema was known as the flicks. It was putting flicker right where we're most sensitive to it. And we perceive flicker up to 60 Hertz. It's actually higher in the periphery. It does depend where you measure it. So with old-style CRTs, you've probably had that experience where it looks steady when you view it straight on, but when you turn aside, you see an irritating flicker in the corner of your eye. But of course, nowadays, flicker isn't really the problem. We've figured out ways of keeping the illumination essentially constant. So it's not that we perceive flicker as such, but temporal undersampling can still lead to artifacts. Just as in this classic example from Edward Muybridge, the image that's on screen there of the galloping horse isn't flickering, but it does look jerky. We're seeing those motion artifacts due to the undersampling. And that still happens today. You get those motion artifacts, whether it's judder or blur, and so on. So we can ask, okay, well, what temporal resolution would our display have to have in order to represent all the visible changes? You might think if we can see change up to 60 Hertz, then we'd need a 60 Hertz display and 60 Hertz capture, of course, as well. But in fact, it's worse than that. If you want to be able to represent 60 Hertz on your display, the display itself has to be updating at 120 Hertz so that you can go from black, white, black in 2 frames. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because finite temporal sampling in the capture and in the display introduces aliasing artifacts. And the visibility of those depends on their speed and spatial frequency, so they're worse for fast-moving objects and at high spatial frequencies. But actually, if you work it out, you find that even if we could capture and display content at 120 Hertz, we would still eliminate all artifacts only up to speeds of around 1 degree per second. And that's really slow, because remember that SMPTE reckons the screen should subtend 30 degrees, so we're talking about an object that moves from left to right of the screen in half a minute, so that is not a fast-moving object. And we see the consequences of those, of course, in cinemas today. So people get around it by avoiding, you don't want to have noise and so on, so you avoid it by removing those high spatial frequencies. You track the object of interest, so things in the background which are moving rapidly on the screen get blurred either by finite exposure times or by finite depth of field. So of course you've got around it by chopping out the high spatial frequencies, but that means you haven't reproduced reality. So my summary of where we are with the temporal resolution knob is that we haven't turned it nearly high enough. We've heard a lot about 48 Hertz in recent years, so-called high frame rate, but really it's less low frame rate. It's not close to our limit of 60 Hertz, and actually, as I've argued, you need over 120 Hertz to move artifacts, even for slow-moving objects. And our poor temporal resolution means that we're not actually benefiting as much as we could from today's good spatial resolution. As I gather was discussed last year, that actually has particular implications for stereoscopic 3D. But I've put at the bottom, maybe you like it how it is, because I know, for example, with The Hobbit, there was some discussion about how some critics felt the high frame rate was too realistic. They didn't like it. It looked wrong. And of course, that's a separate argument. Okay, so I gather many of the subsequent talks are going to be about dynamic range, and I'm very excited to hear them. So the dynamic range of human vision really is astounding. Depending who you talk to, it's at least 1 billion, maybe up to 10 billion, ranging from intense sunlight right down to starlight, sort of 9 orders of magnitude below. And in fact, when we're fully dark adapted, we can actually reach perfect quantum efficiency and detect individual photons entering the eye, which is quite amazing, I think. Of course, that does require at least half an hour to adapt fully, and we'll all have had that experience of walking into a darkened room and at first seeing nothing, but after some minutes being able to make out the outlines of furniture and move around quite well. So I think for the cinema application, photopic vision is probably the most relevant. We're certainly never going to reach those fully dark adapted states. So let's think about the response of the cone photoreceptors then. So cones adapt to their levels. So if you adapt to a particular luminance, say 10 to the 4 candela per meter squared, the cone's going to reach some steady state level of firing. And then if you briefly flash both higher and lower luminance stimuli, the cone will respond with an increase or a decrease in firing rate. And in this way, you can map out the cone's response curve. And you find that ranging from to get the cone from its minimum response to its maximum, you need to range over about 1,000-fold in luminance. But you can also adapt to a different luminance. And there you can see the cone, initially it would be firing rather strongly, but as it adapts, its firing rate gradually reduces and it reaches its new steady state level. And then again, if you test it with flashes of different luminance, you get a new response curve. And so as the cone adapts, and it may take a few minutes to do so completely, then that enables the cone to adjust its responses over a much wider range of about 10 to the 8th intensity levels. Now here I'm just talking about the luminance that reaches the cone in the back of your eye. As you know, your pupil adjusts, so in bright light it stops right down, and in dim light it dilates, and that also helps adapt to different luminances. So the human visual system as a whole can adapt to an even wider range and reach this kind of billion-fold level. And just for comparison, and I want to point out then that so current displays obviously can't match the range of luminances over which we can perceive contrast. Is this a problem? Well, of course, if our adaptation that I've described were actually perfect, it wouldn't be a problem because we wouldn't even notice, right? The display would only have to cover the adaptation state of one cone, so maybe 10 to the 4 would be enough. But in practice, although we do adapt, we are also aware of the adaptation through ways which I think aren't fully elucidated yet. So although I can read perfectly well in a dim Newcastle office or on a bright, sunny Las Vegas day, I am aware of the difference in luminance. And it's also worth pointing out that where we are at the moment is right down the bottom of that range. Another problem is that our current capture and display technology loses detail, so it's difficult to find an exposure which captures a contrast at all luminances. So I gather there's increasing interest in combining different exposures in order to get an image which has detail across a range of luminance regions, so both the bright and the dark regions of the image show detail. And that's essentially a workaround, I guess. When we're talking about capturing detail, what's relevant there isn't just the maximum luminance, but also the pixel depth, so the number of levels that we have available to represent each pixel. So DCI standard of 2002 allowed for 12 bits per colour component, so just over 4,000 levels per colour. And I want to think about, is that enough? Should we aim to go higher than that? Well, one complication is it depends how the levels map to luminance. So when you set a pixel value, what does that mean in terms of luminance? So if you're thinking about this, I want to introduce Weber's law. So this very general idea in all aspects of human perception, not just vision, that roughly speaking, just noticeable differences are fixed in fractional, not in absolute terms, so that the just noticeable difference is greater if it's measured on a higher intensity background. Now that's not, it doesn't hold exactly true, and it's not true throughout the entire luminance range, but for the back of the envelope calculation I want to do, I think it'll work, and it has a great advantage of making the maths easy. So we're going to assume Weber's law holds exactly, and if that's so, then luminance should be an exponential function of pixel value. And that's not a million miles away from the traditional CRT gamma function, which again wasn't chosen based on the human visual system as far as I'm aware, but simply on the physics of how voltage relates to fluorescence. So the point about the exponential function then is that if I make a 1-bit pixel change, so I go from 3000 to 3001, that's going to result in a larger luminance increment than if I go from 1000 to 1001. But because the 3001 will be happening on a higher luminance background, those two changes should be, roughly speaking, equally visible. And so we want to ask, how many pixel values do we need then for a 1-bit change to be just invisible? Well, this is where our contrast sensitivity function comes in useful. We can see that humans can detect contrast changes of better than 1% across a wide frequency range. So if you go through the maths, I think you get an equation like this. So relating the number of levels that you need per colour to the contrast ratio, the ratio of maximum to minimum luminance, and the contrast threshold. So if we feed in some realistic numbers, I believe that for today's displays, the contrast ratio is typically 5,000. I'm willing to be corrected on that. If we put in contrast ratio of 1%, then you work out you need about 850 pixel levels. So certainly well below 12-bit, not even 10-bit. If you were to increase the contrast ratio, go to 10 to the 5, and allow for the fact that we can actually see contrast thresholds down to 0.5%, even then you still only need around 2,300 levels. So again, under 12 bits. So 12 bits per colour should be ample in principle, but certainly displays would benefit from greater luminance range, and not just whiter whites, but importantly, darker blacks. I think that's also important because it's going to benefit colour perception a lot. And that brings me on to the final knob I want to talk about. So, as we all know, the human eye has 3 types of cone receptors, so that means we can represent all colours using just 3 primaries, right? Well, not quite true, because even with 3 ideal primaries, there are some colours that you can't represent, some combinations that fall within the human colour gamut, but outside the gamut that's representable with 3 primaries. Of course, real primaries aren't ideal, they're not monochromatic, and so that reduces the colour gamut still further. And the available range of colours shrinks still further if you want it to be bright. So if you're trying to get high luminance, you're going to need to ramp up the intensity of all your colour guns, and of course that's going to push everything closer to white and reduce the level of colours that you can display. And that's why things like candles are so hard to represent realistically. Either if you make them bright, then they tend to look too white. If you want to keep the range of colours that real candles have, then they're going to end up looking a bit dim. So we could improve the colour gamut by adding primaries. I know various groups are working on that. Or by improving the primaries that we've got, improving the 3 primaries. So this is a figure from a paper a few years ago looking at laser HD TV. But I want to point out that it's not just about the gamut. We also need to think about our sensitivity to changes in colour within the displayable gamut. So this represents a chromatic contrast sensitivity function. It's just the same kind of thing as I showed earlier for luminance. But you may notice that you can see the stripes going up a lot higher towards the left-hand part of the image. And again, if we plot an actual proper lab-measured contrast sensitivity function, you'll notice 2 things about it. First of all, it tanks at much lower cycles than the luminance one, so we are less sensitive to fine variations in colour than to variations in luminance. And of course that's well known. It's why you shouldn't make your PowerPoint slides out of 2 equal luminance colours like, I don't know, red on green text. And it's of course used in compression and broadcasting so that you can transmit the colour image with lower detail than the luminance. I've got a quick demo of this here. If you just look at the sort of white blobs here for a moment, just keep your eyes still. In a moment I'll jump to the next slide. And hopefully you see a colour version of that photograph. Of course, as you'll now notice, it's not actually colour. The colours were all created in your head by the colour after effect. Thank you. But the particular point I wanted to make with this is that I'm hoping you perceive the colours as locked to the luminance edges. So the red stopped abruptly at the edge of the hood, even though the actual colour information available to your brain was quite coarse and low resolution. But the low acuity we have for colour perception isn't the same as low sensitivity, and we're actually very sensitive to colour. You can see at these low frequencies we're more sensitive to colour variation than we are to luminance. So you can see gratings defined by colour when you wouldn't be able to see them defined purely by luminance. And so that means that what I talked about in the previous section on increasing pixel depth is going to very much improve our perception of colour. Now, some of you may be able to tell me what the currently available colour depth is on different commercial displays. I think 12 bits per colour should be ample to represent the sort of fine levels that we can discriminate, but 8 bits that I have on my PC at home, for example, certainly isn't enough. So I think high dynamic range is going to help us there a lot as well. Okay, so that was the end of this quick canter through the human visual system and how it relates to various aspects of image quality. I think we're pretty much there on spatial and spatial resolution, but we have a lot of work to do on the other aspects that I touched on. And of course, there are many important aspects that I haven't touched on at all, such as 3D and stereoscopy and light field imaging and so on. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope that was of interest, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. Fantastic. Have a seat at one of the chairs there. Whoa, that was quite a summary, wasn't it? Thank you, Dr. Reed, for a fascinating overview of human vision. And we're going to continue on now. We already learned one thing now that needs to be taken into consideration by the DCI. It's not high frame rate that we saw the Hobbit series at 48 frame. It was LLFR, less low frame rate. That might be something we consider as a new standard. Our next speaker is going to be presenting some information about a new study that's of relevance here, Suzanne Farrell. Suzanne is a software engineer at Dolby Laboratories, where she has been researching viewer preference on high dynamic range imagery. Before joining Dolby Laboratories, Suzanne worked for HBO, CNBC, and she earned her master's degree in motion picture science at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Please welcome Suzanne Farrell. Hopefully this works for you well. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Good morning. It's real great to be here to present to you about some of the really neat things that we've been working on at Dolby, focusing around high dynamic range. So when you go to theaters today, we've been watching films that have a luminance range that peaks at 48 candelas per meter squared, which is the ISO standard unit for luminance, also commonly referred to as nits. And this was standardized at a time when film projection had certain limitations, such as bulb capability, melting film, and flicker visibility. But now that theaters have adopted digital projection, we're not subject to those same limitations, so what if people prefer a different cinema experience? And I say cinema experience because it's not just about how bright the screen is. There's also black level and headroom for highlights to consider, as this complete range, from the deepest black to the brightest highlight, impacts a viewer's perception and immersion into the film. So before I begin, I'll go over these three basic aspects that make up the luminance range. By black level, we define as the minimum scene luminance. Diffuse white we can also call the scene reflective white, and highlights are specular reflections and emissive light sources that are greater than diffuse white. Last year, we presented a study on viewer preferences for a small screen for those three basic aspects, black, diffuse white, and highlight luminance. The most demanding of those viewers were satisfied with a luminance range of 0.005 to 20,000 nits. So the next logical question became, well, how does this relate to the large screen? Because conventional wisdom tells us that larger screens can be about 0.7 times as bright as a small screen, and the content will appear the same. So we replicated the study from last year using our 13-foot cinema screen. All the stimuli and design, experimental design, including field of view, were identical, with only screen size and system luminance limits differing. The setup we used for the large screen was capable of a luminance range of 0.002 to 2100 nits. The low black level was achieved using a 2.4 neutral density filter, which was only used to test the black image set. The 7 stimuli for the black and diffuse white study were photographed using high dynamic range techniques and illuminated to have a low dynamic range. The narrow range was then normalized so that 10 to 90% of the image luminance was 1 log unit, as illustrated in the histogram to the left. This was done in order to minimize simultaneous contrast and present the most challenging cases for a display to achieve a perceptual black, and to offer the most creative flexibility for a better palette. Image adjustments were done in shifts in log luminance, which correspond to a changing of the scene lighting, which is relevant in the physical world, and you can see that in the histogram to the right. In contrast, doing that in the gamma domain would not really correspond to anything that you'd see in the real world. Testing for viewer preference for the black and diffuse white luminance allowed for short-term light adaptation, so an interstimulus image was used as a dampener. The animation is a simulation of the 2-interval forced choice method of testing that we used. The timing of the presentation and the light level of the interstimulus image were determined by media statistics based on scene cut length and average picture level. for the highlight study, we were able to use a larger set of stimuli, which allowed us to test images that had various highlight sizes and image mean luminances. We define highlights, again, to be specular reflections and emissive light sources above the diffuse white. So the question was, well, how do you define diffuse white? For our two studies, for the large and small screen, we placed the diffuse white to be at 300 nits to stimulate current consumer TVs. And by isolating the highlights in this way, we were able to maintain the image luminance of the reflective region and modulate the highlights independently. So here you can see that first we'd clip the image to the diffuse white and then slowly add the highlights back in at a constant interval. And here is the combined image histogram for one image set. You can see that the reflective region will remain the same and only the highlights are modulating. And one more time, as an image scan line, the reflective region again is constant and the highlights are modulated. Because the average picture level of the image remained constant, we were able to use the method of adjustment. Using this style of testing was what allowed us to test more stimuli, as well as making it easier and faster for participants. While the two-interval force choice method was very rigid in its timing structure, using the method of adjustment allowed users to click up and down through the stimuli in order to find their preference. This experiment was designed to avoid a number of common side effects, and some of these side effects are evident in similar studies, but we sought to avoid them altogether. Two examples of this are using monochromatic images for the black and diffuse white study to avoid the increased perception of saturation with increased luminance, and also using the 1 log unit range to minimize simultaneous contrast effects in order to get a better black level. The 1 log luminance range technique was also implemented to avoid questions regarding rendering methods, including contrast and tone scale adjustments. And not to throw all these pies in your face at once, but you can see we have a lot of participants from different backgrounds and demographics. These are the results from last year's small screen study. Half the viewers were satisfied with a black level of 0.1 and a diffuse white of around 700 nits. But for system design, though, it's always best to satisfy more than half the viewers. So in this case, they would require a range of 0.005 to 20,000 nits, with a diffuse white luminance of around 4,000. In comparison, these are the results for the black level of our cinema study. There's a really large difference between the preference from the small screen and the large screen. About 90% of the viewers prefer a black level of 0.002 nits. And no one was satisfied with the black level found for the cinema study, or the small screen study of 0.1 nits. And if you look where the cinema currently ends today at 0.025 nits or so, hardly anyone is satisfied with that. Moving on to the diffuse white, there is a surprising result where there is no significant change between what viewers prefer for a small screen versus a large screen. And actually, the steeper curve for the cinema results indicate that there were more agreement among viewers. And as you see here, 90% of those viewers were satisfied with a diffuse white luminance of around 3,000 nits. And for the highlight results, they're following the similar trend from the small screen study. Altogether, the luminance range preferred for the 90% of viewers was 0.002 to around 7,000 nits. One caveat to this, though, is that our system did clip at 2,100 nits, and we chose to intentionally clip some of those images by overdriving the projector with signals that we knew would clip. In the case of the highlight images, clipping would first occur at the peak region of the highlight, while the edges would still be able to be adjusted. And because of this, viewers who chose clipped highlight images were most likely to saw the advantage of having highlights with the edges being brighter. So the total preferred range for the large screen environment was found to be 0.002 to 7,000 nits, which translates to around 22 stops of dynamic range. And you can compare that to the 10 stops that cinema is currently capable of. At equal fields of view, the cinema study resulted in an extremely low black level preference, about 10 times as dark as what the cinema can do today. And surprisingly contrary to previous studies, there is no significant difference between the luminance for the diffuse white on the small screen versus the large screen. And it's kind of fun that both studies want 22 stops of film, so why not just turn it up to 22? So it's a factor of both going darker and going brighter because it's that full range that really immerses the audience. So the positive findings from this experiment on preferred luminance allow us to explore other impacts a higher luminance range has on the movie-going experience, because there's also areas such as viewer comfort, illumination of the audience by the screen, and increased visibility of image artifacts such as judder that are currently being investigated. And here's some related work that focused mainly on the small screen case, and this cinema study will be presented in more detail at the SMPTE Fall Conference. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I bet there will be some questions, and we will have time at the end of our session here. But we have a couple more speakers to add different perspectives to understanding the human visual system this morning. And our next one up is a person that's probably familiar to most of you, Dr. Hans Hofmann. Dr. Hofmann holds a diploma in telecommunications engineering from the University of Applied Science in Munich. In 2007, he completed his PhD at the Brunel University in West London at the School of Engineering. He worked at IRT in research and development, and since 2000 at the European Broadcast Union in Geneva as a senior engineer of technical development. Hans is very active in the SMPTE, having been the head of the Technology Committee on Networks and File Management, and he has served as our Standards Vice President, as well as being a SMPTE Fellow. Please welcome Dr. Hans Hofmann.
Thank you. You actually promised not to read all of this. Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you know that in the EBU we have a program to look into UHD TV. And we try actually to understand, and referring to Jenny, what you said, what the different knobs actually mean for us as broadcasters, as television providers, in terms of providing a better immersive image quality to the home. What we have done in the past, we have looked quite deeply into the resolution impact, and we found a good standard here how we can actually evaluate this with subjects. This was the ITUR BT500, which many of you know quite well. Then we went on last year, we have looked into the implications of higher frame rates. And again here, ITUR BT500 has helped us a lot. However, then when we came to the knob of dynamic range, then actually we were running against the wall, I have to say. Because ITUR BT500 does not give us the help here in order to do subjective tests. This was actually then the point when we said, oh, EBU needs help. And in collaboration with the EPFL, which is a university in Switzerland, and of course our partners from Dolby, we started to investigate actually a new kind of a dynamic range methodology, and I just briefly want to go over the results and the work that we have done together in collaboration with our colleagues. So actually, why do we that? I've mentioned it before, there is no standardized method at the moment available on how we can actually evaluate subjectively and reliable higher dynamic range. So we needed to look around and discuss actually with the academia, with the experts from Dolby of what can we actually do in order to have really a repeatable and robust methodology in order to understand the benefits perhaps and measure higher dynamic range, or as we call it at the moment, image dynamic range. So the long-term goal, what we actually have, is to get an understanding about the benefit, and not only the benefit on one part of the chain, really in an end-to-end chain to understand what makes Pat Griffiths better pixels into the home. I think this is all what we want to identify. So what we actually have done, since there was no 4K high dynamic range display available, we concentrated first of all about what is available in types of prototyping with a resolution of 1080p. This is really what we had to do. We looked on viewers, experts and naive, so non-expert viewers as the target, and this is actually what we then have started. But we are not alone in that one. I think everybody in the world who says I'm a little bit a scientific body, a standards body, they want to have a piece of the cake. And it's broad now, it's really broad. We have the ITUR Working Party 6C, a rapporteurs group, they're working on dynamic range, particularly looking into the applications for ultra-high definition. We have WICVEC, where you have all the experts on psychovisual studios, on subjective testing, also part of the ITUR. We have MPEC, which is now starting to look into also the coding of dynamic range and what that means. In SMPTE, we have 3 projects and a study group, I believe, which looks into perceptual EOTFs, which is underway at the moment. JPEG is looking into it, of course, and Turaj, maybe you know a lot about the JPEG work. This is certainly important for all the photographic environments. DVB is going to have a workshop on HDR on 17th of June in order to look what it does mean for the transmission side, and of course EBU together with the partners, we also have a little piece of this big cake in terms of doing the subjective tests. So as usual, you perform training sessions with the poor person sitting in the room for a while. Here, you know, some of you know the test sequences. You undertake them into a visual test, the Snellen test, and also color. You train them actually before you let them go into this kind of subjective testing. You point out where they have to look, particularly looking into the dark areas, outlining actually the areas which are of interest, and this is particular, of course, the black environment. Do they see details in the black? Do they not see the details in the black, and so forth? And it's important that the training for all the test persons is approximately the same. Yeah? That's quite important. Otherwise, the results on subjective testing, they go absolutely off. We had a number of test clips provided by our colleagues from Dolby. Some of you have seen them. They correspond to a particular genre at this point of time, and maybe this is something what we need to change into the future, to have different kind of genre when we undertake the tests. But the test clips have been actually also representative for some film movie type of content, certainly. Not yet, I would say, absolutely the broadcast or sport environment was not yet covered. What was the test setup? As you see here, very traditional. We had 2 test subjects at 2 different types of viewing distances, 1.5 meter equal to 3H, and then also a little bit far away, which 2.7 meter. We have tested HDTV resolutions, yeah. So we went not into the viewing distances of a 4K environment. The horizontal middle of the screen was the eye height, as you know. And then we had 2 different variants on how we did present actually the test sequences. Simply because we didn't know at the end what is the right variant. So the good thing of having EPFL in Lausanne doing one variant, and they have done a side-by-side split screen, to us in Geneva, where we have done actually the more traditional way of the ITUR BT500 methodology to do it time sequential, where actually the memory effect comes into the game of the viewer. So he sees a sequence, and then there is another sequence that he has to memorize, or she has to memorize the differences. So this was important that we have these 2 variants actually also in our tests. A critical issue, and I will mention it again, was the ambient light conditions. ITUR 500 tells us you have to have 10% of the peak brightness of the display as your ambient light. Well, difficult. You run from 4,000 nits down to 100 nits, different variants, and we keep actually the ambient light constant. There have been a number of comments from the subjects. And then as the display, the Dolby Pulsar display with 42-inch. So the scoring, what we have done, is the following, and that's a little bit about this methodology. We had the 4th choice, where you say, okay, I like the left or like the right, and then there were 2 variants what we have in terms of the preference scale. From left, much better, slightly better, the same, slightly better, better, much better, to the right side. Yeah? So you have actually a horizontal way of voting. And this was done by the colleagues at the EPFL. At the EBU, we had done A and B, because we showed the image A and afterwards the image B, so not in the split screen condition. And then again, we had a scale where they could cross actually, and then we measured with a ruler actually and put all the calculations around that. So these were the variants again, what we have done, 4th choice and also the scaling. And these were the results. What you see on that axis here, but probably you can read it. It's not working. Let's try that one. Also not working. No, anyhow, you have the preference probability over 4,000 nits, and Here on that axis, you see 100, 400,000, and 4,000 nit of peak brightness. You have on the right side the results what we had from the EPFL on the force choice, and on the left side the EBU force choice results. And I think you clearly can understand that there is a trend. There is an absolutely clear trend that as we go up in the brightness, certainly the viewers expressed a higher appreciation, in a way. That was clear. However, the methodology itself still had, in terms of the errors, a relatively high error bar. You see this in the confidence interval, which is given here. Then the next one was actually that we looked into the preference over the 4,000 nit. And again, we have the EBU on the left side, we have the EPFL on the right side. The curves are indicative, absolutely the same. Again, we have a perceived, what I would say, appreciation as we go up in the brightnesses. That's absolutely one clear outcome. And we also have seen that the error bars are much smaller, so it's much more confident in terms of the results, what we have achieved. The important message is also that as well as the EPFL and the EBU have provided in their analysis and the test similar results. So they back each other up. And that's a very important message when you want to verify is a methodology reliable or not, that you have different laboratories performing the tests. So the results in a summary, because we only have 10 minutes time. And that's quite interesting. As far as the viewing distance is concerned, because we had different subjects at different viewing distance, and you have seen actually the red and the blue curve. And this is what we always said. It's pretty much independent of viewing distance. Whilst we know resolution is very depending on the viewing distance, here we have now a parameter where we say, well, actually, even you in the back would perceive if there is a higher dynamic range image here. You can see more details into the dark. That's what we want. So good outcome in a way. The preference scale creates more reliable results. This is what we have seen in terms of the confidence intervals than the forced choice. We did also a little bit on the DSQS at the EBU. Did not really turn out to provide very good results. So we need to move on the preference scale. The difference in the image dynamic range is visible. It is visible, but we did not actually test under our conditions how good it is. How can we quantify, actually? We rather looked into the methodology, and this was our first aim. Now, subsequent tests will have to answer more questions, certainly now. And this is something what I really would like to mention, because we ask each of the subjects, so how did you feel in your test? Aside of that after 20 minutes, they are all bored and they hate the pictures, but what they all said is that, well, the ambient light, it was too dark, it was too bright, I need sunglasses and I don't need sunglasses looking at the images. So this is an area of research which we have to do. 10% was not good. 20% I think was done by Turaj, correct? You had a 20% ambient lighting. Some of the subjects said, oh, that's too bright, I want to go down. So that's a difficult environment at the moment, what we have to look at. So the next steps which are in front of us, we have to do future testing. I mean, this is not conclusive. This is a first step what we present to you today. We need to look a little bit into image brightness, dynamic range context, certainly what is good, what is less good, but also we have to have new content genres. That's quite important. To have a variety of new kind of also broadcast typical genres, and this is pretty much what we would like to do in the future in our collaboration. So we need to be a bit careful with final conclusions today. The trends are there, the trends are visible, and also for methodology, we are on a good way forward, I think. Now, it's very important that we acknowledge actually everybody who works here over the nights. I see my colleagues, I see the colleagues of Turaj, always in the laboratories then at midnight or later than midnight, measuring with their rulers actually all the sheets, the paper sheets, the evaluations. So please join me in acknowledging all the colleagues here from Dolby, from the EPFL, and also, of course, my colleagues at the EBU and the members of the EBU who helped to make these tests successful. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. Nice to see this new information, and we have a lot to learn. However, you did emphasize it's all about content. Otherwise, we got bored. Our final speaker for this morning's session, before we get to our Q&A portion, is Dr. Touraj Ibrahimi. He is a professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, and head of the Multimedia Signal Processing Group there. He has been the head of the Swiss delegation on both JPEG and MPEG standardization efforts involved in JPEG 2000, JPEG XR, the new JPEG XT image compression, as well as MPEG 2 for .264 and .265 video compression. Dr. Ibrahimi is the first to propose the notion of quality of experience as a way to measure quality of multimedia content as an alternative to quality of service. He is the author of more than 200 scientific publications and holds a dozen patents in the field of multimedia. Please help me welcome Dr. Touraj Ibrahimi.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I guess Pete just forgot one important piece of information. It's the first time I come to an NAB show, and I hope I deserve to come back. It's been great so far. So, how do I move the... Okay. So let me actually confess, already Hans told you basically 99% of the story, which is great. And as you know, in university, one thing we have that you guys elsewhere don't is time. So we can think and take time, make experiments that many of you don't have the opportunity of doing. And this is what we did. In fact, I'm going to spend a little bit of more time and take you a little bit of more your time to tell you that actually among the 4 different variants that EBU and EPFL tested in terms of evaluation, since we had time, we actually tried a 5th one. And I would like to report that and tell you how they look like. The motivation was exactly the same as Hans mentioned. So actually, everybody is interested in knowing how much HDR content, video or image, can improve the quality of experience. So this is what we did too. The other thing that also was mentioned already by Hans is that nobody really knows how to do that. So, you know, we have attempted 4 different ways, and here comes the 5th way. The 5th way, we actually surrounded on a use case that is, what is the perceived video quality as a function of the display peak brightness, which is exactly what you heard from Hans again. You're going to hear this sentence many, many times. But the approach we did it actually using something called full paired comparison. It's not a new method. It was used first in the 50s. So this is like 65 years ago. I was not born, and I dare anybody who was around was in his Pampers or her Pampers. So we basically took the dust out of this, modernize it, and use this. Now, what is actually interesting about this full pair comparison is that, first of all, it doesn't really have a very, very big load in terms of cognitive load on the subject. Subject don't need to think too much. I actually dare people to really find a method that is even simpler. You are given 2 situations, and you are asked which one you prefer, and if you don't have a preference, well, say it's the same. You could apply it for many, many things, even in heterogeneous situations. You could watch some content on a mobile phone screen. You can watch on a TV and ask people, you know, which one you prefer, first, second, or it's the same. You could actually even go with your friends and have a great night out drinking, or have a romantic dinner with your better half and ask, I'm not going to ask you this, but you could even ask which one you prefer, A, B, or the same. So you see, it's just great. It's just a very, very interesting, very intuitive, very simple way to evaluate things, and this is what we did. In terms of test material, Hans already mentioned, in fact, he showed you already some of the content. All what I need to say here is that we didn't use the 6, but we used actually 8. So exactly the 6 that you saw, and 2 more content added to it because we have more time. I already told you when I started. And another thing that is actually interesting with pair comparison and this kind of simple methods is that it doesn't really, you can, but it doesn't require training, which is great, right? You can just take anybody with any type of background. You don't need even to train them. Just ask them this question. And this is our lab. You saw the EBU lab, so this is our lab. In fact, the person you see standing is one of my PhD students who has been working day and night, as you heard. And we used the Dolby pulsar monitor. This is a 400 nit peak brightness display based on what they call PQ EOTF. I'm sure many of you know about this. If you don't, talk to Dolby people and look at it. It's a great monitor. In terms of test room configuration, we could sit 3 people in front at each session, and the viewing distance, actually we use only one, 3.2 times the distance of the height of the screen, and the lighting system was controlled. It was indeed 20 nits, as was already mentioned. We also tested our subjects, both in terms of acuity and color vision, and in total we used 21 naive subjects. It was almost 50-50 male-female. If you are from a technical university, you understand this is a huge challenge that I'm very glad we could overcome. Now, a little bit more about this methodology of pair comparison. In fact, so we have 100 nit, 400 nit, 1,000 nit, and 4,000 nit. If you actually do the math, there are 6 combinations of comparison that you can do between each of these. We added to that also 4,000 versus 4,000. You could call it a reference just to make sure that things are doing well. So there, if you show 2 times the same thing, you should get 50-50, right? Also in these tests, like previous tests we did together with EBU, in our variant we use side-by-side. In fact, this was the conclusion of our collaboration with EBU also, that side-by-side actually is a better and easier way to do this kind of test. And I already said that, I repeat it, the question was very simple. Do you prefer the left, the right, or it's the same for you? So we analyze the results. Now there are different ways of analyzing them. You could of course analyze them by just saying what is the percentage of those who said left or right, or they are the equivalent. But there are mathematical tools that are as old again as the pair comparison that allow you to turn that to some sort of mean opinion score, the MOS type of correlation. And this is what I'm going to actually show you very quickly. So here, actually, you see the probability of the preference of left and right. On the top, you have 4,000. Compared to 4,000, you see there is a huge green area. That huge green area means people did not see any difference between left or right because they were the same. And this is obviously something you expect. If you go down, you see, I'm sorry, maybe not all of you can see in details all the comparisons, but we basically compare all the different combinations you can think of. And you see, for instance, if you compare 4,000 to 100, which is the third row, or the third from the bottom, you see that there is a lot of red. So people basically, in majority, they have preferred very clearly 4,000 versus 100 that is not. You could turn that into also quality scores with the mathematical tools that I told you. And in this case, you see something very, very similar to the results that were shown actually by Hans in the previous presentation. One thing that I would like you to actually pay good attention is how great is the confidence interval. The confidence interval for 100 and 4,000 is so small you don't even see it. And in the middle, you see a very, very good distinction between 400 and 1,000 nit, which I have to say I'm very proud of people who did this in my lab. I'm very proud to have the opportunity of working with these kind of people. Now, mathematically, of course, you can calculate that, and this is what we did, and we compared actually the results that we obtained This is referred to as EPFL full PC pair comparison, to EPFL preference scale that was shown by Hans, and EBU preference scale that was shown by Hans. So if you look actually at correlation between these results, obviously if you take EPFL and compare it for exactly the same thing with EPFL, it's 100%. That's just to, you know, check that everything is all right. But between EPFL and EBU preferred scale, actually the correlation is 95%. This is actually very good. In fact, in a lab, if you do the same tests on different subjects again, usually it's around that number. So I think that we can be very confident for that. Now, the full comparison together compared to EPFL preferred scale is 92%, which is not bad. And with EBU is 86%. It doesn't mean that one of them is better or the other one. Just this is just a preference and correlation. Let me conclude. The conclusion is very, very similar, actually, to what Hans said. I just want to emphasize a few things. One is that a full pair comparison seems to really correlate well with these alternative techniques. Because it is, its load, cognitive load is much less, and it doesn't really require too much training and things like that. I personally prefer it, so I would like to advocate that as something really that people pay more attention to. In terms of increase in brightness, in terms of quality between 100, 400, 1,000, and 4,000 nits, of course, Hans' results were showing that. He mentioned that here we can actually see it in a much, much more clear way with this test. And obviously, this improvement is there. And in fact, between 100 and 4,000, if you look at the both results that I showed and the results that Hans showed, there is 2 scale, which is 2 points over a scale, which is a huge actually improvement that comes out between 100 and 4,000, which is really good news. I don't think that you get these kind of things if you go from high definition to ultra high definition in terms of resolution, or if you go from current frame rate to higher frame rate video. Last but not least, of course, this is not finished. There is a lot to be done. Of course, the problem of ambient light that was mentioned by Hans is one of them, but also the type of display that is used, its size, and a number of other issues are also among the important things that are important to still elaborate. I would like to acknowledge my PhD and student and postdoc who did this, but also Dolby with the help actually that provided with us. And I guess I can put here, right, that if there are any questions.
We're going to have time for questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Touraj. Great information. And it is time for questions now. So if you have any, please step up to the microphone. I'd like to bring one other speaker to our panel to help field questions. Somebody very familiar with this, Mr. Scott Daly. For those of you that don't know him, Scott has an MS in bioengineering from University of Utah with a thesis in neurophysiology. He has a distinguished career at Kodak, Sharp, and the last 4 years at Dolby. And Scott has always specialized in the applied vision and its interaction with art. So please step up to the microphones if you have any questions. And while you do, let me start, Scott, by asking you a question. You've been studying these issues for many years and just heard a great panel of experts at this. What do you think is the main takeaway that our audience should absorb from all this new information about the human visual system as it applies to our motion imaging industry?
Well, I guess for me, it kind of poses a challenge, and that's from Jenny's work focusing on the psychophysics, very abstract test stimuli. We see that the visual system is extremely demanding. None of our technologies can compete with it. And then when you start applying it to actually things like watching video, you see different results. And it's basically trying to figure out a reasonable intermediary between the pure psychophysics in the lab and then what you actually need for entertainment applications, at least for our case today.
We have a lot to learn. I think our first question is over here. Bill?
Hi, Bill Miller. First, I want to thank the panelists and you, Pete. This is a fantastic panel you put together. I'm chairman of the SMPTE study group on reference display, actually project group on reference displays, which means for the last 2 years I have learned more than I ever wanted to know about this particular subject, although my knowledge is kind of meager and insubstantial compared to you guys. However, there was one thing that you mentioned in terms of the testing that you did at the EBU and EPFL, which was the ambient surround illumination. We did some subjective testing about a year and change ago within the Hollywood, when we were here in Hollywood. Hans, I think you remember it. And one of the things we determined was that a 10% surround level is way too high. As a matter of fact, the colorists who worked with us on this, because we did it at one of the major post houses, said that they could not possibly do color grading on a film or a television show with that level of surround illumination. We eventually settled on around 2% as a more realistic number. So that's something you probably want to figure into your next round of testing. I think if you had people with problems at the higher luminance levels, it may have been because you had so much ambient illumination. At 4,000 nits means you'd have 400 on the backdrop.
Well, it's your response. Hans, I see you have a mic out.
Well, I think it's exactly one of the issues what you're highlighting. I mean, in the professional environment, we limit the peak brightness to 100 candela, or 100 nits. And then, of course, we go down in terms of the ambient lights in the professional environment, if you have said. But now, when we change that, yeah, when we say our future in X years might be that we have 1,000 candela, I don't believe in 4,000, but something in the area of 1,000 and so forth, then this will have a dramatic impact on the professional side, on professional reference displays, on the ambient light conditions, etc., and so forth. As I said, I mean, we are starting. We are at the beginning at the moment, I believe, in evaluating and understanding everything.
Yeah. If I could follow up?
Yeah. So
yeah.
If it's quick.
I think also with these higher dynamic range displays, I think you need to consider setting the ambient backlight based on your reference white, not specular. And I think that's going to have a huge impact. I do have one other comment. Dr. Reed, you referenced SMPTE EG18, engineering guideline EG18 in your paper in terms of horizontal spatial resolution. EG18 1994 was withdrawn sometime between 1996 and 2000 because it had substantial errors. I don't think that was one of the areas where the errors were. But I would prefer not to see references to EG18 since it's a 20-year-old withdrawn document.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
I just had
if I may, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Let me actually add a few things. You're absolutely right that the background and the environment lighting cannot follow the REC 500 type recommendations, because if you're talking about 4,000 nit maximum brightness in displays, that makes 400. 400 is great to torture people.
Yeah.
Definitely not to ask them to make subjective evaluations. So it should be much less. As you see in our results, EBU used 10 and 20, if I'm not wrong, and EPFL used 20. But we did a study, but not in this case, about a couple of years ago, on the influence of a few of these parameters when you view a content, not necessarily HDR, but tone-mapped HDR on mobile phones and tablets. And there, of course, our results are there. Somebody can make the calculation. But you can, for instance, show that tone mapping depends a lot on the luminance of the environment. In fact, some tone mapping that are great for darker surroundings are exactly the opposite for let's say, outdoor.
And we have some other questions here that we want to have time for. Sorry, Bill.
Yeah,
no.
we can talk
Bill?
offline.
Yeah, there will be time offline. But I do have one question myself for Dave Schnelly. Since we started 10 minutes late, you're going to give us a few more minutes for questions, right? I thought so. Very good. Okay, we have a question up here.
Hi. Thanks to everybody. A very basic question. I didn't hear much about the difference between the full-frame cinematic shutter versus the TV scan lines. And I was wondering if that creates a different perception or if this is a settled issue.
No, basically they're just showing the same thing but as a different view of things. So the image histogram will show you the number of pixels that are at certain luminances, whereas the image scan line will just show you the output pixel values. So essentially it's the same thing, but just a different kind of view of it. Does that answer your question? No?
I'm not quite sure, simply because I think people perceive it in a different way. I think the sequence of a full lit frame versus a full dark interval is a different experience from that of scan lines that, you know, light up and disappear.
I think that is
That's more for Jenny, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it much, I must admit. I think it's going to affect the particular sorts of motion artifacts you get. So I don't think it matters once you've got to a high enough temporal sampling that everything has moved beyond the window of visibility anyway. But at the moment, if you talk about, say, motion artifacts, especially in stereo 3D, then you're going to get a different sort of artifact depending on that kind of scanning.
And of course, modern flat panel displays will have less scanning, and they'll be displaying from a frame buffer similar to film.
Right, yeah, the raster scanning is definitely going away. The main difference, and if you think of like a rolling shutter on a camera, so you basically have shearing type motion artifacts. I think that's the key thing you're thinking of.
Okay, with that, we'll turn over the floor to the next session and a great program today. Please join me in thanking very much our presenters today and our panelists. And I think we have lots more to learn about the human visual system. Thanks.